Good afternoon. Right, thank you very, very much, David Marshall and Nic Rotton, for joining me for what's become our weekly funding update. And my initial thought was going to be there may not be much to talk about this week because the scheme has settled down and there's not a lot of movement. But actually, we've just had our pre-chat as we always do, and there's quite a few interesting things that have come out of that I think will be really worth sharing with people. So should we just start with a general update on where CBILs are, what kind of stuff you're seeing this week generally?
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of activity. The feedback we're getting from the banks is that they are absolutely snowed under. Lots of applications. Some are being highlighted in the press when we see them being granted, but I'm sure there's some smaller deals being sanctioned as well. But it's just an unbelievable volume. And we know that the guys on the front line are the ones we're talking to. They're working into the evenings. Several people I spoke to yesterday have been working through the weekend. So there's not a lack of will at the front line of the banks to actually get these applications through. They're dealing with probably an unwieldy system and some difficult criteria for some cases, but it's not through lack of effort at the front end. They are just absolutely swamped. And
I think it's worth saying, isn't it? This isn't, people are getting very frustrated with their banks, but it really isn't down to the banks. They are doing, the CBILs loan and the enterprise finance guarantee, it's a clunky system to start with. It's got a lot of onerous requirement, hasn't it? I think people really are doing their best here.
Yeah, it's a system that was foisted on them in a matter of days, and they're trying to work it through their normal processes and procedures because there isn't anything else, to be honest.
Yeah. Okay, that's really good.
I think the other thing to say, Serena, is that there are a lot of people that the banks are effectively meeting for the first time in a borrowing situation. So that in its very nature is a challenge for a lender, irrespective of which lender it is. If you're meeting someone for the first time, then there are more questions to be asked and more things just to understand.
Of course.
Irrespective if you're an existing customer, if you've never borrowed from a high street bank before and then you turn up on their door with a request for £50,000, it's going to be a surprise because they don't really know you with the greatest will in the world. It's the nature of the relationship. So I think the banks have been really trying to find ways of upping the resource. I was talking to one bank and they've pulled a lot of the people that were working within branches that clearly are now closed into their sort of online systems. Get a bit of support, a bit of experience in there to help push through.
Yeah.
So we are seeing that. But I think the crucial statement we're hearing from the banks is, on the guys that we talk to and the girls on the front line, is just be patient.
Yeah.
We are going to get to you. We are working as quick and as hard as we can to get there, but you just need a little bit more patience. And clearly, the crucial message that I would want to get across today is, if you're going to submit, get all your ducks in a line. Get all that information that you know that the bank will want. Get it all together in one go, so they haven't got to keep coming back and ask you.
Yeah, because I guess that keeps pushing to the back of the queue, doesn't it? And it's delaying it for everybody else.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there are applications still going in that aren't eligible because they're not driven by coronavirus necessarily, or people are just saying, I'd like to have a bit of a fighting fund, so I'll put in for a loan because it's interest free. That would be a good idea, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
And people that have put in for loans, got them agreed, and then aren't intending to draw on it because it's just it might come in handy. Well, all of those applications are getting in the way of the businesses that are absolutely desperate to get some working capital.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think this comes back to the panic buying thing in a way, doesn't it? People are, you were saying earlier about the flour, situation. Yeah. People are buying flour just because people are buying flour, and I've heard of people who want to maybe take on debt or take on these loans just for, like, say, some free cash or a bit of a buffer, even for acquisitions. It's like, this isn't what it's for, and please don't clog the system up with it. People have got to play their part here and not be selfish, and just, if you don't need the money and it's not for survival, please don't apply because you're stopping other people getting it.
It's a tough call because clearly, there is that panic element within it, and you'd rather be on the front foot than the back. But nevertheless, the unintended consequence of that action, of that application, is that it is slowing down everyone else's process. Yeah. And as David says, the ones that really need it are then just in amongst all of that.
Yeah.
But
you mentioned earlier a client where you'd actually gone through the process with them and you'd found they didn't need the money in the end.
Yeah, we started off with a relatively small business, but it was a client and wanted some help through the system. I was helping him put together the cash flow forecast. And to start with, he thought he needed £60,000, and we got that down to £40,000. But he hadn't really gone through his costs with any sort of forensic way to say, I can cut back on this, I can maybe get rid of a van, I could ask for a payment holiday on another thing. He was paying his mother for a lockup. Well, in the cash flow it looked like lockup, but when we got into it, he was basically paying his mother £500 to use the garage each month. Well, that was an easy one to knock out.
Yeah.
And we got the figure down to a level where he said, well, I could probably borrow that from a mum and dad or somebody in the family.
Yeah.
And he was thinking of taking on a loan initially of £60,000 and having to repay that over the next 5 years. And that would have been a real burden to his business. Whereas, by looking at it in a slightly different way and just really taking a sharp knife to the costs and deferring a few more payments, he could actually get away with probably, a relatively small loan and a family loan. That's
really interesting. I just wonder how many people are doing that as well, who haven't really gone back and torn their cost base apart and going, do you know what, there's so much stuff I could do without here. There's the furlough opportunity. And also, we can't expect to come out of this with the businesses we had before. Most people are going to have to trim and shave and scale things back to be strong enough to grow again in the new normal. So it's unrealistic to try and think you're going to have to fund keeping your business intact now, because that probably won't be necessary in the future.
And I think the thing to remind people is it is a debt. It is a loan that they're taking on. Okay, so they might not have to make any payments for the next 12 months. But the reality is, then for the next 4 or 5 years potentially, it is going to be, a commitment that they're going to have to make, in addition to all the other things that they're currently battling with.
More difficult economy, they're going to have more debt around their neck, which I think should be avoided at all costs if there's another way.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And also I think people need to be mindful of the fact that while there's no personal guarantee for this particular facility, if they have other bank facilities already in place with personal guarantees there, then, if they really aren't confident that the business is able to service and repay the existing and the new debt going forward, they've still got a personal guarantee, personal liability on the existing facilities.
Yeah, that's a really good point. People should just be really think carefully before you just pile in applying for money. Do you really need it? Make sure you've got your ducks in a row. If you do, make sure you've cut all your costs first, and just really think about taking on that debt and how that's going to feel for the next 5 years. Good. Okay. I read I think it was the FT at the weekend, that NatWest had lent the bulk of the funds so far, and I think HSBC were second. Is that what you're seeing out there?
Yeah, I think it's just anecdotally. That's the feeling that I'm getting. It may be that NatWest RBS, being government owned to some extent, feels slightly more obliged to take a slightly different line. That may be the case. Certainly, back in the last credit crunch, that was definitely what they felt as a bank. When the government stepped in with ownership, and they really saw it as their role to do all they could do to, if you like, repay the faith the government had shown in them by putting money out the door.
That's good to hear.
I think the other consequence of that is that they are more, of all the lenders that we know, they are the ones that understand the EFG system probably the best.
Interesting. Okay.
So as a consequence, they're more from a processing point of view, and understanding how it works and why it works is probably more ingrained in them than perhaps other lenders and smaller lenders, or ones coming to the process.
That's interesting.
Because that EFG was generated out of the last credit crunch, and that was a tool that they used to a large extent at that time.
Yeah. So talking of people coming into the scheme, obviously the big news last week was Funding Circle being approved. Mixed views on Funding Circle. Obviously, there are quite a few people pleased about that. Quite a few people would have wanted to avoid them like the plague. What would be your sort of basic pros and cons around if Funding Circle are right for you?
Well, Funding Circle and alternative finance generally, you don't go to alternative finance if you can get the funding on the high street. The high street banks are always going to be the best source of low-priced, low-risk debt. If you can't get the funding that you need through the high street, it's probably because there's a higher level of risk attached to it, than the banks want to live with. So you are going to be paying more. Also, the banks are very wary of reputational risk if they ever take action against somebody to recover their money. The likes of Funding Circle and certainly the peer-to-peers, it's not their own money, it's somebody else's money. So if somebody defaults, they've got an obligation, not like a bank just ultimately to its shareholders, but they've got an obligation to the individuals or the institutions that actually put that money in. So yes, they can be quite robust in the event of a default. Often, if people will communicate with them and have a dialogue with them and continue to offer some sort of payment, they will very often live with that. You know, I'm sure there are instances where people felt they've been quite hard done by. And you know, they probably will find that a firmer line has been taken than by the high street banks. But that's kind of the market that they're operating in, and the reasons are, you know, they're trying to recover the money on behalf of the lenders that put their hard-earned cash in the first place. Yeah,
okay. And obviously the talk's been around, will they be aligning with the government's line of no personal guarantees? And we're not quite sure on that one yet, are we?
No, we've been talking to Funding Circle this morning, actually, because it was only last Friday the announcement was made. They're going through training, retraining, first part of this week, getting all the systems in place between Funding Circle and the British Business Bank for guarantees. What we've heard so far, and it's still quite fluid, so it may change, but they're hoping to take applications on Monday. Okay. They're looking to support businesses that have been trading for 3 years, which is different to their normal offering. Incidentally, they've ceased to operate their usual loan system. When they announced they were accredited by CBILs, even loans in the pipeline were stopped, and they stopped all the previous activity. And they're now only lending institutional money. They're not lending private individuals money. That's another change they've made. But yeah, looking for businesses that are trading 3 years rather than before it was basically one set of accounts and some management information, and they'd consider an application. I think there'll be a cap probably of £250,000 on the loan. Okay. And if you've already got a Funding Circle loan, then you'll probably find that that cap is going to be probably a lesser figure that you'll be eligible for. We're still waiting to see the final detail, but we are pretty close to it. We'd expect to know the final details by Friday, and perhaps we can put something out to you at that point.
That would be great. Yes, please.
And loans accepted from loan applications accepted from Monday.
Brilliant.
Not all brokers. I think I've got 750 broker introducers, and they're only taking introductions from 159 of the larger brokers. And we're part of that, so we'll have access to the scheme.
Right, okay. And sort of roughly where would you expect interest rates to start from with Funding Circle?
Haven't a clue at the moment. I've got a feeling that it's going to. I'm just trying to think how they're going to cope with the fact that they don't have a PG. In the event of failure, then they are pretty much certainly going to lose 20%. There's no way of recovering that whatsoever.
So they're going to price
now, whether that will be factored into the pricing, I don't know. Just my feeling.
Okay. Yeah. Well, so if you do hear on Friday any more details, that would be really good to hear.
Yeah, we'll get those through to you.
Brilliant. And the other news last week then was the Future Fund.
Yeah, the Future Fund. Yes, that has been announced rather than launched. It doesn't become effective until May, but there is information on it on the British Business Bank.
Yeah.
And it was really to support those younger, growing startup businesses that perhaps aren't demonstrating profitability, so don't qualify for the CBIL scheme. And I think a lot of us were hoping that it was really going to be applicable to a lot of early stage and startup businesses that we see. The detail of it is a bit disappointing, as much as one of the criteria is that the businesses must have raised £250,000 in equity over the last 5 years, and the loan is only match funded. So having raised you £250,000 over the last 5 years, if you need £250,000 now, you've got to find £125,000 from a private investor, and they will match fund that.
Okay.
So I think from the number of startup and growing businesses that I know, I can't think of that many that will meet that criteria. So in that sense, it's quite disappointing.
It's probably going to help the bigger ones that are quite well backed VC wise, but it's not going to help your average tech startup, is it?
No.
There's maybe been bootstrapping or has some modest angel funding.
No.
No, so it leaves them out in the cold.
Yeah.
I think, you know, the fairness in these schemes, I was lucky enough to be on a call this morning with the small business minister, and there was an interesting phrase he used. He said, all of these schemes have been set up incredibly quickly, and there will always be unintended consequences of such schemes. He said, these schemes have hard edges as they're designed, and it's always going to leave certain people out. I got the feeling that there's this very much this flexibility of keep moving those edges and trying to bring more people in, but you know, that very, very quickly designed schemes aren't going to have everything thought of.
Yeah.
And we kind of have to be realistic about just what's being achieved here in very short space of time.
Yes. Yeah, and I think the point to make is that the scheme in itself is fine. It's only when you then start to try and implement it that the consequences start to then and the ripples start to occur.
Definitely.
And then you can find out who's going to survive and who sadly isn't going to make it because of that. And it's, I think they, to be fair, the Chancellor and his team have to be commended for the ability that they have listened to people, and where they have seen areas that are being overlooked, that they listen and they try to find a way to fill those gaps as best they can. But you can't please all the people, unfortunately.
No. I mean, it's certainly the way it came across today was like they're constantly taking feedback from all these companies, and they're constantly trying to find workarounds for all the things where people are falling through the cracks. So I certainly got the impression it was very, very pragmatic approach being taken, and that they haven't just set there the rules tough. I mean, even the dividend thing, I have got a bit of hope around the dividend thing may happen, but that's another story.
Keep banging that drum, Doc. Keep banging that drum.
Oh God, yeah. Oh yeah. Another thing I was brought up in the call earlier was that there seems to be quite a lot of success around bridging. So banks providing that short-term finance, say between getting the furlough grants through. How is it easy for people to get access to that? Because if you just need money for a month or even for a couple of weeks.
I think in normal circumstances, if you need a little bit of short-term cash and you can demonstrate that you've got funds coming in to repay it, in that sense, for a bank, it's relatively easy. I think the challenge is, in practice, how do you get hold of the person at the bank that you need to speak to?
Okay.
So if you've got a relationship manager, then hopefully you can get hold of them sooner or later. They'll return the call. Yes, they'll be very busy. It could be that they've got some local discretion with some of the banks to put modest increases in place, and can do that relatively easily, especially if they know the business. But for small businesses where they haven't got a relationship manager, it's really access through a telephony centre, what the normal course is, and be armed with all the information, have some evidence available that you've maybe submitted a claim, or demonstrate that you've previously submitted a claim and been paid for it. All those things help the decision-making process at the bank.
But fundamentally, that should be a fairly straightforward ask. Then if it's trading business, they just need some money for a week, 2 weeks, a month, just until furlough comes through. It's just that bridging finance should be, and again, nothing wrong with going and get that kind of debt, because you can pay it back quickly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, brilliant.
And even better, it will be paid directly in the bank account.
Yes.
The bank doesn't have to rely on you to pay the check in. The bank will know it comes directly to them.
Of course, yes. Brilliant. Anything else that we didn't mention? One thing that was interesting that you mentioned, there's a different strategy for banks approving the smaller loans to the bigger loans. They say they've got kind of different channels internally.
Yes. Yeah, happy to share that. Certainly, it seems to be that at the smaller end, it is very much that, as David mentioned, that telephony style online portal process. The downside of that is that that's where the vast majority of applications are going. That sort of up to 50k type loan amount is kind of the majority of where people are asking, and that's where the majority of clients are, whether they're small borrowers or never borrowed before. They're the S of the SMEs. Those are where the bigger challenges are for the banks, because it's more difficult to drive those volumes through what were relatively tightly manned teams, but they're doing lots of pulling in branch staff, because branches are now closed, in order to try and help support those areas. On the larger loans, when you go above the sort of 50, 100K, then it is through that business relationship manager.
Yeah.
The benefit is that you've got some relationship. The downside is that the process for that relationship manager is tougher. He's got more, it's probably taking him half a day, probably a day, to complete that report to support the application.
Wow.
Each one
Wow.
into the credit. So if you get 10 applications a day, you can see why they're working till 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night and at the weekend.
And of course, that bottleneck is replicated at the credit office, because not only they've got lots of relationship managers throwing applications out overnight, they've got all those hitting the credit office the next day. So it's you can see why the whole system is getting a bit snarled up.
So when there's all this criticism, sorry.
I was just going to say, what I would say from helping somebody through the online portal, and bear in mind the online portal is just a way of getting information. It's not an automated system at the other end. There is just somebody going to open that and look at the information. But even before you could get to the application form, there are, I think, probably 4 or 5 screens of questions that you needed to put all the right answers in to get you to the application form. It felt like a bit of a win just to get to the application form, to be honest. And I know the criteria fairly well. So I would say to anybody that's starting that process, have the CBILs criteria in front of you, so that when you're going through those initial questions, you can put yes and no in the right boxes and don't get thrown out of the system before you even get to the application form.
And only bother to do this if you're really, really sure you need the money, that you can't find it elsewhere, and that you want to take on that level of debt.
Yes. Yeah.
And be sure that you got, and you say the CBILs criteria, where can they find that to check?
Well, the banks will have that on their own individual websites, but it's also on the British Business Bank website as well.
People should double check that before they even think about applying.
Yes.
Brilliant.
Definitely.
Okay, I think that's covered everything that we talked about there, doesn't it? That's a really good update, guys.
We'll come back to you as soon as we hear more from the funding circle side of things. We'll come back to you and we'll give you a quick update in terms of where we're at in terms of any kind of sort of more specific criteria we've got to work with.
That would be great. Thank you very much. Well, as always, thank you for your time, and thank you for your absolute expertise and sharing what's going on the front line with us. I know people are finding it really useful.
Good to see you.
I'll see you again next Wednesday.
Cheers.
Bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.